I have the opportunity today to give a sermon, and I'm going to talk about the book of Job. We've been talking about that in my page 4 article and my Among Friends article. In fact, the title of the sermon is Two Facts About the Book of Job, and I'd like to discuss those. I want to mention this. In my preparation, it is my perspective that religious people make two big mistakes about the book of Job. It is my opinion that religious people among the Church of God make two big mistakes. So obviously we're not going to, the book of Job, we can take weeks to talk about it, but I'm going to talk about two mistakes, and I'd like to hear that in your mind. Before I mention that, again, for those of you who might be listening in from Kansas City or Tennessee, I want to mention that, I'm going to give this opening story that I've told out there, just so you know, for friends here in the local group. I've been covering in my traveling sermon, my traveling Bible studies and sermons, I've been talking about the book of Job a lot. And it goes back to November, the first weekend of November. Do you remember the shooting that happened down in Sutherland Springs in that little Baptist church? If you remember, that happened there the 1st of November. The 1st of December, I had the opportunity to go down to that area. On Saturday, I spoke at the church pastored by Terry Post, a little church down there. But see, Terry and Judy, they have employees that were shot and family members. I think a cousin was shot. And so they are right on the firing lines of a tragedy that happened. And so what I'm doing in these interactive studies, and if some of you are listening in, if I come out to your area soon, you may find we're going to talk about the book of Job in the interactive study, because what we did down there was to try to prepare people to help. Now, what we say to those people is what we cover in the interactive study is to help us be grounded in what we know about the book of Job, and then we have to use wisdom of how we help other people. So if you remember, then I had the opportunity 1 month after that shooting to go down there. On Saturday, I sat with that church for an hour and a half interactive Bible study. We talked about the book of Job and how to help people. And then that night, we went over to the church in the memorial over there, and I sat for 3 hours listening to a family who lost family members in that shooting. And of course, the main thing we learned is Job's friends really messed up when they started talking. At the beginning, when Job's friends first came upon Job, they sat there for 7 days and didn't say a word. And that's when they got A's for listening. It's when they started talking, they messed everything up. And that can be proven in the book of Job. So we were there Saturday afternoon talking about the book of Job interactively, learning how to do this. And then we went right on the firing lines there and got to practice it for 3 hours listening to family members. So as I'm going out to different places now, that's what we're doing at church services. We're talking about how to help people be ready to help other people. That's what we're trying to do. By the way, we did go to church that Sunday morning down there, Sutherland Springs. That church normally has 60 people, and they would have 250 to 500 people still, because people like me, who I went there to show my support, many people go there to show their support, so they still have a lot of people. By the way, the week I was there, the Texas Rangers were still standing outside in case there was going to be a copycat person. Even the church down the road, 5 miles down the road, they had policemen down there at their church service in case there was going to be a copycat. Also, I mentioned at the time that I wanted to meet the guy named Steve. Steve was the good guy who shot the bad guy. And I didn't know if he would be at church that Sunday morning or not, because he'd been bombarded by the media, and he was kind of trying to stay low because he was just getting tired of answering everyone's questions. Well, my good fortune was when I got down there at church, Terry Post went over and said, "That's Steve right over there. That's the guy who shot the bad guy." And so I went over to talk to him, and I wanted to talk to him. I wanted to congratulate him for what he had done. Now, I have journalistic training, but I did not want to treat it like a journalistic experience because I knew he was tired of journalism. So I had no pen and paper, I had no recorder, but I was asking questions. And I didn't do any, sometimes in journalism you follow up with tough follow-up questions. But I didn't want to do any tough follow-up questions because I wasn't trying to make it hard on him, I was trying to learn from him. As soon as the discussion was over, I quickly went over and got a piece of paper and started writing down as much as I could remember about what he had said. But what was amazing about this, it was almost like a David and Goliath story. because the bad guy had a helmet on. He had a helmet on, covered up, and he had a bulletproof vest on. He was covered with full armor. Steve was barefooted, because Steve was at his home about a block away, and he heard this. It'd be more like a tapping on a window. If you tap on a window, his daughter was in the house saying, "What's that tapping on the window?" And Steve said, "That's not a tapping on the window." He recognized it as gunshots. It wasn't big booms, it was like a tapping. So he grabbed his weapon and did not have his shoes on. He ran out there barefoot, dealing with this guy heavily armored. And they were exchanging gunshots. Steve was trained in how to use a weapon and trained about all this thing. He knew that if he shot him in the chest, the bulletproof vest would protect the man. But he also knew that it would send bolts on him. So he was pummeling him in the chest, and he actually got the guy to drop his gun. He actually kept shooting him in the head, knowing the helmet was going to protect him and not kill him. But you keep getting punched in the stomach and in the head. He was trying to disorient the guy. Boom, 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 boom. Finally, when the guy dropped the gun and went into his pickup truck, he raised his arm like this. And every deer hunter knows he shot him right there where there was an opening between all this armor. And this man was a hero, and to hear him talk, he was giving credit to God the whole way. Now, I don't know how involved God was. I like hearing the stories. I don't make the judgments on that. Neither should you. Neither should anyone else. If someone says they know exactly, they speak for God, ignore people who claim to speak for God. But listen to the stories. And I don't know how involved God was. All I know is I really was happy the way it turned out. I was happy this man was a hero. And he was very humble. He was not taking glory in himself. He was glorifying God. And so I really love it. By the way, I want to go back there. I'm going to call Terry and go back down there and visit the Sabbath group down there and talk to them down there. And then next Sunday, we'll go over Saturday night to see if there's still people hanging around that little church. Maybe they're not there anymore. But then I'll go over Sunday morning, probably Terry, Judy, and I'll go over Sunday morning. Again, to be available to serve, to be available to help, but also be learning as well. But that's what I've been talking about. That's why I've been talking about it. That experience has helped me to realize we can use the book of Job to help people. Now, I want to mention something to you, and I don't want you to react by raising your hand or anything. I use the book of Job to help people. My wife has told me that the book of Job would not be of any help to her. And before you judge her, if you don't understand this, you're not ready to help anybody. So if you're ready to criticize my wife or people like my wife, you are nowhere close to helping anybody. My wife said, at the end of the book of Job, God doubled everything, doubled the camels, doubled the donkeys, doubled everything, and doubled the children. And my wife said, it'd be nice to have new children, but I would want my old children back. And if you don't understand that, don't try to help anybody. If you can't comprehend that, you are not ready to help, no matter how much Bible you can quote, no matter how much Bible you can say. And I'm really glad my wife told me that, because as I said, I use the book of Job to try to help people. But she helped me realize that sometimes if I quickly realize the book of Job's not going to help them, I bail. I back out. Why should I do something that's not going to help? So it helps me as I try to help people. I'm watching. Are you finding this helpful? Is this information helpful to you? And if the information's helpful, I love talking about the book of Job. If the information's not helpful, if I see the sense that, I abandon ship and say, we got to try a different way to listen and to be helpful to you. So again, like I said, we talk hours about the book of Job, and I just want to talk about 2 facts about the book of Job. Just 2 facts. I'm not going to go great length of all the things we've talked about or written about. I believe there's 2 big mistakes made about the book of Job. 2 big mistakes I see regularly about the book of Job, even among the church of God. That doesn't mean the people who make the mistakes are bad people. It just means they have a misunderstanding about the book of Job. Mistake number 1 is religious people say that the main reason God initiated the 2 trials upon Job was because of Job's sins. Quite frankly, that's what the three friends were saying. What'd you do wrong, Job? What'd you do wrong? And we're not going to go through all of the fact is God initiated the trial. Won't go through all that. God initiated the trial. By the way, Satan initiated the details of the trial. But it was God who initiated the trial, who said, he said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job?" And Satan said, "Well, if you touch all that he has, he'll curse you." So Satan initiated the details, and God said, "I'll pull back the hedge, so be it. We'll go with your details, but I, God, initiated the trial, and you provided the details." And then the second part of the trial was, he says, "Oh yes, if you touch his flesh, he'll curse you." And God let him do those details, but he kept barriers on it. But the point was, God initiated the trial, the two trials. But it wasn't because of Job's sin. But we'll talk about that. Mistake number two, religious people say that Job did not sin after the two trials came upon him. Friends, many people have it wrong both ways. They have it just the opposite both ways. See, because part one, before the two trials, God complimented Job's behavior. That's fact one. And fact two, after the two trials came upon Job, and after the three friends started talking to him, Job drifted into sin. Let's look at the first fact. Let's look at Job chapter 1, verse 1. A lot of this is the prosperity gospel, the health and wealth gospel. What'd you do wrong? And by the way, we do know that sometimes we suffer consequences for doing wrong. We understand that. But there are times we suffer consequences for following God and following Christ. And of course, Peter talks about that. Don't suffer as a murderer. Don't suffer as a busy. In other words, Peter would say, don't be making stupid decisions that cause you to suffer. But there are times you suffer for doing the right thing. And that's the essence of the book of Job. Job was doing the right thing. Let's look at a few things about Job. Job 1:1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, and one who feared God and shunned evil. Down to verse 5, after his kids were having this frolicky time, they had a feasting time. So it was when the days of feasting had run their course that Job would send and sanctify them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. So he was making offerings, which was the system at the time. He was making offerings for his kids. A lot of you do this. You don't do the physical offering, but a lot of you pray for your kids. A lot of you fast for your kids. A lot of you do a lot of good things for your kids, and that's a good thing. Chapter 1, verses 20 through 22. Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell to the ground and worshipped. And here's what he said. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin nor charge God with wrong. His first reaction was very, very good. Now look at Job chapter 2, verse 3. Then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there's none like him on earth? Stop and think about that for a second. Job, there was none like him on earth. I like to say it this way. I'll let God say it the way he wants to say it. There was no one better than Job. So he was the best thing going. There may have been others as good as him, but there was none like him. So in other words, according to this, it wasn't because of his sin. So friends, please do not get it in your head that Job's trials came because of his sins. That was not the reason why the story of the book of Job. And this will tie in. Actually, I'm going to set you up for next week, because next week I'm going to go take it a step further. But I want us to get these 2 points down. I'm going to spend the time I have. I won't have to take a lot of time. I want to take the time I have to really lock into this. And by the way, Job 2:10, after his wife said to curse God and die, which is real interesting because You can look at the word Hebrew for curse. It could mean something different, but let's assume the English word curse is correct. Let's assume it's correct. By the way, in the sermon, I want us to cut Job a lot of slack. But we want to cut Job's wife a lot of slack too. There have been, through the years, I have in sermons painted Job's wife as a shrew. I have painted her as a witch. I have quoted this saying, "Curse God and die." I've done that. And I can't wait for the resurrection to apologize to Job's wife. Because even though the phrase curse God and die, even if that's the correct word, even if the word curse God and die is the correct word, which I'm not sure it is, let's assume it is. Let's assume that English word's correct. She may not have said it in a shrew manner. She may have said it in an overwhelmed manner. She may have said it in a defeated manner. She had been, as a caregiver, my wife's a caregiver now. Many of you have been caregivers, and it just wears you out. So she's watching her husband have all these boils on him. She's watching her husband just suffer. She's watching her husband go through all this nonsense, and she might have said it in a desperation like, "Honey, why don't you just get it over with and just, what you're doing to yourself, it's wearing me down too. What you're doing to yourself, why don't you just curse God and die?" So again, all the times that I've painted her as a shrew, and probably most sermons you hear will paint her that way, the words are there, but we don't see the attitude. And again, I recommend we have a lot of sympathy for both Job and Job's wife. But so if someone says, well, Job had problems because of his sins, and they'll say this, Job's problem was self-righteousness. I have a lot I could say about that, but I don't want to take the time right now. But I want to nuke it. I want to nuke the idea that Job's trials were because of his sin. Why did God say, "Have you considered my servant Job"? See, I'm going to let you think about that for a week before I give my opinions on that next week. Why did God say, "Consider my servant Job"? It wasn't because he was a bad man. We're seeing just the opposite. He was doing a lot of good things. The second mistake people make, religious people say that Job did not sin after the two trials came upon him. Fact number 2, after the two trials came upon Job and after the three friends started talking, Job did drift into sin. He did sin. And it's so funny to watch people have a tough time defending it. We had in the interactive Bible study, there were actually some people in here a couple weeks ago who really had trouble at thinking Job sinned. In places I go, they have really trouble. Like one place I went, he was like, "Well, Job really didn't sin." Yeah, he sinned really good. How do I know? Because I read the Bible. I read the Bible, what he actually did, the fact what he did. But people have the notion, well, he didn't sin. And unless we throw stones at him, he probably sinned less than I would have. And I am not different from you. I know you. He sinned less than the way you would have been. So none of us should get on our high horse. I'm not saying be mad at Job or throw stones at him. But hey, folks, we can't live in la-la land and say, "Oh, Job didn't sin." He didn't sin before the trial, but he sure sinned in the trial. And God understood that, and God loved him, and God led him to see himself for what he really was. That's the whole point of his last words of repentance. But so please, you don't realize this, but if you say that Job didn't sin in the trial, you're embarrassing yourself. By the way, you know where they get that? We had someone in our study here, a sweet lady, smart lady, who's not attending here at the moment. But here's where they get it. If we look at Job 1:22, "In all this Job did not sin nor charge God with wrong." In Job 2:10, "You speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity? In all this Job did not sin with his lips." Now, why do I say Job sinned? Because the book of Job doesn't end after chapter 2. If the book of Job ended after chapter 2, my conclusion would be he didn't sin with his lips. He didn't charge God. But from Job 3 to 31, he charged God. And his three friends were a bad influence on him. and that's the whole point when we have these little interactive studies, you and I do not want to be a bad influence on people. We don't want to go up to people who are handling adversity really, really well, and all of a sudden we start talking to them and we nudge them to sin. That would be a bad testimony for us. We don't want to do that. But let's look at Job 33. Let's look at some scriptures identifying what the sin was. Someone could say, what was Job's sin? Well, let's read the scriptures, okay? Let's let the Bible identify what his sin was, okay? Job 33, verses 8 through 13. By the way, I want to mention, to remind you, Elihu is a good influence on Job. I don't want to take the time with going to the scriptures, but Job wanted an umpire. The King James says plainsman, an umpire or mediator. Job got to the place where he said, I don't want to deal with you. You're unfair to me. That's sin, okay? That's frustration for sure. I don't want to deal with you. You're unfair to me. I want an umpire. So the three friends, God says in chapter 42 that the three friends gave bad advice. But Elihu comes on the scene. He's not one of the three friends. I heard the pastor who preceded me over in the church, over in Worldwide Church of God, over headquarters there, Big Sandy, excuse me, he in his sermon talked about Elihu as a bad guy. Now, how I know that is because years ago I mentioned Elihu was a good guy, and people came up after me afterwards saying, the previous pastor said this and this and this. He said just the opposite you said. And I quoted the scripture. I said, the previous pastor was wrong. If you're going to believe Job 42:7, the previous pastor was wrong. He's a nice guy, but we all make mistakes. We all say wrong things. So I know people have sometimes say Elihu was a bad guy. But Elihu was a man that God said, okay, you don't want to deal with me. You want to deal with another person. I'm going to send Elihu. Now, by the way, Elihu was younger than the three friends. And that's why he says, I didn't speak at first because I'm younger than y'all. You're all supposed to know more than me. So God sent, Elihu goes in and speaks for God. And he approached Job. And here he comes in chapter 33. In fact, before we get to verse 8, let's look at verses 6 and 7. Truly I am your spokesman before God. You wanted an umpire. You wanted a mediator. I'm here. But I'm also formed out of clay. You wanted someone formed out of clay? You wanted someone physical? Okay, I'm physical. You get your wish. I'm going to talk to you as well. Verse 8. Job did not get his information from hearsay. Elihu did not get his information from hearsay. Elihu did not get his information from the internet. Elihu did not get his information from the Journal, which was a good newspaper. Elihu said, verse 8, surely you have spoken in my hearing. I am basing what I'm saying to you based on what I heard you say. Not through a third person, not through other people, not according to gossip, not according to rumor. I am basing what I'm hearing. Here's what I heard you say. And here's what Job said. I have heard the sound of your words saying, Job started saying, I'm pure. I'm without transgression. I'm innocent. And there's no iniquity in me. By the way, consider this for a minute. It's somewhat true in this regard. Didn't we say at the beginning of this that the trial did not come because of his sin? So if Job said, I don't know why this trial started. It wasn't my sin that started it. If he had said that, I would have said, you're right, Job. The trial did not start because of your sin. But he got frustrated and got defensive, and he started then going too far. Because then he started sinning. then he started expressing sin. Because look at verse 10. He says, "Yet God finds occasions against me." God's out to get me. That's what Job was saying. That's what he was feeling. God counts me as his enemy. He puts my feet in the stocks. He watches all my paths, and he's going to get me. And he turns around. Every time I turn around, there's God causing me to have trouble. So this is not good. Chapter 34, verses 5 through 9. For Job has said, "I am righteous, but God has taken away my justice. I'm right, and life is not fair." God is not fair. You see, now this is the attitude the three guys were stirring up. This is how he was reacting to the three guys. And God had to have him repent of that, and he did repent of that. Verse 9. For Job said, "It profits me nothing to delight in God." Now think about it. Have you ever thought that? Have you ever been in a trial, especially a trial not of your making, and thought, why is God letting this happen? What kind of God are you to let this happen to me? Don't you like me? You're supposed to answer my prayers. You're supposed to deliver me. What are you doing letting this happen to me? I happen to be innocent this time. See, Job was getting very frustrated, and he's expressing himself, and Elihu's hearing it. Chapter 34, verse 37. If we were to actually put in words what his sin was, here's some of the words you could say. This is not the worst of it. We'll read the worst of it. For verse 37, he says, of chapter 34, "For he adds rebellion to his sin, he claps his hand among us, and he multiplies his words against God." If this were a test given by a teacher, a technical answer would be, he multiplied his words against God. Now, how do we know that? Because if we look down to chapter 38, verse 2, after Elihu talked to Job, then God talks to Job. And what does God say to Job? "Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge?" So we see what Elihu identified as sin, and the first time God challenges Job, he's saying words without knowledge. Look back to chapter 35, verse 16. "Therefore Job opens his mouth in vain. He multiplies words without knowledge." So if you really want to get technical, this is some of what his problem was, and this is what he had to overcome. But in spite of all that, if you want to know, to me, the most concise explanation of Job's sin, if we're taking a test and we had an open Bible test, look at Job chapter 40, verse 2. This, to me, would be the best synopsis of Job's sin. I don't think self-righteousness is the best way to describe it. That can be a part of it, but that's not nearly what it's about. Here's God describing Job. We saw Elihu describing Job. We saw God challenging Job. Chapter 40, verse 2. Remember now, God challenged Job twice. And Job gave two answers. He gave an answer in chapter 40, verses 4 and 5. And then he gave the better answer in chapter 42, verses 1 through 6. But the first, and by the way, it's really amazing. You look at the two challenges. My opinion is the first challenge is stronger. You might think, well, didn't God come up with a challenge stronger? Actually, I don't think, to me, I can't hear the words, so I don't know the tone God said it in. But when I read the words, I think the words in the first challenge is stronger, and the second challenge is more like, have you seen that I made the sea monsters? Have you seen how beautiful I made the sea monsters? Now, do you think a God who can make sea monsters, do you think he has the right to deal with mankind the way I deal with mankind? So again, the way that works, the way he's saying that. So here's the concluding comments for chapter 40, verse 2 of the first challenge. Shall the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? He who rebukes God, let him answer it. My recommendation is, if someone asks you what was Job's sin, that verse typifies the worst of Job's attitude. But the point is this, again, I'm not wanting us to throw stones at Job. But I really want to nuke the idea if you sit and think, Job never sinned. Early in the trial, he didn't sin. Early in the trial, he didn't charge God. But man, oh man, when he got wound up, he was charging God left and right. He was charging God all over the place. And in his charging God, he was creating quite a mess. But he finally repented. He finally repented in chapter 42. So again, the two mistakes. Religious people said that things happened because of his sins. Wrong. The next thing they'll say is, well, he never sinned during the trial. Very wrong. He was accusing God of, he was correcting God. He was rebuking God. I hope you recognize that for what it is. So now you see my opinion of what the two mistakes are. You see my perspective of what the two facts are. Now I want to conclude with the following two questions that I want you to think about. As you think about the reality of what's happening here, have you ever considered why God initiated the two trials? What was God planning to accomplish in the life of Job through these two trials? I hope that you have a very bountiful week thinking about that, learning from the book of Job, not getting caught up in the two common mistakes, not getting caught up in the two common mistakes taught by preachers in the church of God. But I hope you'll think about the book, pray about the book, study about the book, understand what I consider these two mistakes, understand the facts, that what's happening there, and next week we'll talk about why God put Job through this, why God initiated the trial, and why he allowed Satan to come up with details that gave him a really tough time. So enjoy your study this week.